My dear children, today's topic is themes of research and applications. And research and application is related. Yes. And the important functions of psychologist also is research. And research means systematic investigation or scientific investigation. And we can solve various problems also. So on the basis of research findings, we can apply, we can solve various problems in our day-to-day life. So research and application, is related. So now, the first theme. Psychology, like other sciences, attempts to develop principles of behavior and mental processes. You know already what is behavior, what is mental processes. Mental process, you know already how our mind works. And behaviors, you know how we react, our responses. And psychology, like other sciences, you already know psychology as a science and why we call psychology as a natural science, psychology as a social science. And like other sciences, attempts to develop principles of behavior and mental processes. Yes. And one of the important function of psychologist, is research. Yes. Proper experimentation also, and collect data properly, interpret results. Yes. And various kinds of branches of psychology, already. And biopsychology, clinical psychology, developmental psychology, experimental psychology. And their research also in that particular field, and the role of psychologist, the role of developmental psychologist, what are the role of clinical psychologist. Yes, and the themes of research in these fields differ from each other, obviously. The role of experimental psychologist and the research of experimental psychology is obviously differed from, the role of developmental psychology. Yes, their perspective is different. And experimental psychologists, study the process of perception, learning, how can we enhance memory and memorization process, thinking, motivation. Yes. And the physiological psychologist also attempt to examine physiological bases of our behavior. Yes. Physiological bases of motivation, such as physiological basis of our hunger and which brain part is responsible for hunger motivation. Yes. And the role of the important function of brain and spinal cord. Yes. And the developmental psychologist study, qualitative and quantitative changes. And our height, our weight, as well as our cognitive development, our personality development, our moral development. And already the social psychologist, their research area. Yes. And how can we resolve conflict? How can we reduce prejudice, etc. So now the next theme, human behavior is a function of attributes of persons and environment. Yes, is important, for our behavior, and environment is important. Yes. And behavior is the product of, person and his or her environment. Yes. And the first class I said, and psychologist, we consider, individual differences. We can't compare one person to another. Yes, no two individuals are the same because their environment is different. Yes. And they vary with their respect to their intelligence, their attitude, their different values, their different kinds of personality. Yes. And psychological test is important. We can identify, individual's personality, individual's interest area, aptitude. And on the basis of psychological testing, we can differ from one person to another. And psychological test came to be constructed to measure, such differences. Discipline, called differential psychology, which focused mainly on individual differences. Yes. And psychologists also believe that and variations in behavior and which occur due to environmental factors. Yes. For our behavior, our culture, our society are important. And already, I said, for our behavior, one important part our biological aspects and other important part our environment. Yes. Now next theme. Human behavior is caused. And most psychologists believe that all human behavior can be explained in terms of causes. And causes, mainly two types, internal and external. Yes. And important part is that a particular behavior, has different causes. Yes. The important thing, human behavior has multiple causes. Human behavior has multiple causes. And when you will know about psychological disorders, various kinds of psychological disorder. We can explain the causes of psychological disorder in terms of various perspective. Like, biological perspective we can explain. And on the basis of society we can explain. And various kinds of psychological model also. And the schools of psychology. Behavioristics perspective, psychodynamic perspective, cognitive perspective. Yes. And for anxiety, for depressions, what are the causes? Maybe, illogical thinking, irrational thinking is one of the cause of depression. Yes. So human behavior has multiple causes. And now next, theme 4. Understanding of human behavior is culturally constructed. And one video, I already said what is culture. Yes. And culture, our rules, regulation, norms, values, which are carried from generation to generation. Yes. And culture, determines our food, our dressing style, our language, etc. So, understanding of human behavior is culturally constructed. And there are psychologists who believe that most psychological theories and models are Euro-American in nature and therefore do not help us in understanding behaviors in other cultural settings. So, cultural variations is important. Yes. And on the basis of culture, our behavior is also differed. Culture is one of the factor. Yes. And Western culture and Asian culture is different. Yes. And various kinds of theories, like Maslow's theory, need hierarchical theory. And these theories also based on American culture. Yes. And Maslow said, mainly 5 needs. Your book has mentioned, NCERT book has mentioned 5 needs. Physiological needs, safety needs, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and last, self-actualization. And physiological need is the basic needs and important needs, Maslow said. But in Japan, the safety needs is important. Yes. And now next, and theme 5, human behavior can be controlled and modified through the application of psychological principles. Yes, an application of psychology is diverse field. We can apply the knowledge of psychology. We can apply the principles of psychology. And now, what are the goals of psychology? I said, we can describe behavior, we can explain behavior, we can control also our behavior, we can predict behavior. And we can apply various kinds of principles also, various kinds of methods also. Yes. And now, psychologists and make certain intervention into the lives of needy people. And the role of psychologist. And where we can apply the knowledge of psychology. In diverse fields we can apply. Yes. And we can modify the individual's behavior. We can solve various kinds of problem. Yes. In any kinds of, eating disorder. And we can use cognitive behavior therapy. For anxiety, we can use this kind of therapy. And depression also. We can change individuals' illogical, irrational assumption. We can provide proper reward. Yes. For modifying behavior. We can reduce the hyperactivity. And already various branches of psychology also. And the role of clinical psychologist. We can identify the particular disorder. We can diagnose also, provide therapy. Yes. And various kinds of fields and various branches. We can solve problems in organization, in industry setting. Yes, we can provide community mental health. And you know already what are the roles of educational psychologist and school psychologist. So, the fields of psychology you know, and we can apply the psychological principles in diverse areas. Thank you, my dear children.